Okay, let's go ahead and begin, I think. So, Anil, yes, if you could put up the prayers. We'll start with the prayers as usual. We've been reciting the Heart Sutra for this particular module of Discovering Buddhism, where we uh, discuss emptiness. And so I will actually be alluding to a little bit of the Heart Sutra today in my talk, but as we go through this, try to bring to mind whatever your own understanding is of emptiness, that things lack any kind of concrete inherent identity, that they're illusory in a way. We talked about this a little bit in the last class, that things are arising on the basis of a variety of factors, and so they don't really have any ability to set themselves up. And this is what Avalokiteshvara is speaking to in this sutra through the power of the Buddha, talking about emptiness. So let's recite this together. I prostrate to the Arya triple gem. Thus did I hear at one time the Bhagawan was dwelling on Massive Vulture's Mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvati Putra. Oh, need to go back one. No, the other direction. That's okay. Okay. Said this to the Venerable Sharadvati Putra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared, Tayata Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Soha. Whoops. need to go back to the, we still aren't finished with the sutra. We need to do the other prayers as well. Sorry. So yeah, page down then. And Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvati Putra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagawan. Then we'll go on to do the short mandala offering prayer, which will be on the next page, I think, or not sure, but with this file. Yeah.
Short mandala offering.
Yes. So again, this is just making this vast pure offering to the gurus, to our the holy beings, so that we can receive their inspirations and blessings, so we can become just like them. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryata Yami. And then one more prayer, the Refuge and Bodhicitta prayer, which we do once in English, twice in Tibetan, bringing to mind these 2 thoughts of refuge, finding safe direction in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and then the thought of bodhicitta, which we'll also meditate on shortly, again, once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyen gi pe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki chanyen gi pe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Okay, thank you, Anil. We'll go on uh, to do a short meditation. Again, just to meditate on bodhicitta as well as to calm the mind a bit. And we'll start with that, just focusing the mind on the breath. And no doubt you already have a way that you work with the breath. If you need a suggestion, generally I suggest working with the area around the nostrils where you feel the air coming in and out as you breathe in and out. And just focusing on that sensation that occurs in that area. But in any meditation on the breath, we want to be kind of paying attention occasionally to see the quality of our meditation. If we check in and see that we've lost the breath, that we're elsewhere through other thoughts, preoccupations, then at that time we correct the meditation. Letting go of whatever distracted us and moving the mind back to the breath. So let me ring the bell here from my side. We'll do a few minutes in silent meditation, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to refresh your bodhicitta motivation. So now let's set our motivation of bodhicitta. And in last week's class, we were speaking to how we realize emptiness through acknowledging dependent arising, the fact that everything arises on the basis of various factors. And the coarsest way that we can see this is that things arise from causes and conditions. As we set this motivation of bodhicitta, we see that this is operative in terms of our own enlightenment and being able to help others to attain enlightenment as well. That if we are ever to achieve this result, we have to create the causes and conditions. Everything that is produced arises on the basis of causes and conditions. Absent of those causes and conditions, things will not arise. So as we come together again today to study this profound topic of emptiness, we can incorporate an understanding of dependent arising into setting our motivation, recognizing that it begins when we have this intention to become enlightened, this mind of bodhicitta. This is the seed from which your own enlightenment will develop, rooted in great compassion, in great love, the wish to free all beings from suffering, the wish to place all of them in happiness, and the recognition that we have to become enlightened to do this. So therefore, we generate that motivation that seeks that goal and also is committed to doing whatever we can to move in that direction, day by day, month by month, year by year, lifetime by lifetime even, to move towards enlightenment by creating all the causes and conditions that will result in that state. So within that understanding, it, as I said, begins right now in this very moment by refreshing this motivation of bodhicitta, thinking that we're here to work on ourselves and our own understanding of emptiness so we can eventually help all beings to know this truth, to know the true nature of things, and through that become enlightened themselves, just as we are intent upon becoming enlightened. So hold that motivation very deeply in your heart for today's teaching, so it becomes part of the causes and conditions that will lead to your own enlightenment and the enlightenment of all beings. Okay, good. So as I said, in last week's class, we were working with the concept of dependent arising as a way of realizing emptiness. This is probably one of the best ways to realize emptiness because it's a reasoning that allows us to understand how things exist. Towards the end of last week's class, we looked a little bit at this idea of these two extreme views that we could fall into. Of course, we're in the one extreme view right now. This is where, all of us, through the force of our own ignorance, as I mentioned in the first class, have been reifying things, have been instilling things with a quality that they don't possess. We kind of created our own fiction out of the world around us, and the world around us doesn't have any of those qualities of inherent existence, substantial existence. Again, we're going to talk about that concept a bit more today. But this imbuing things with that is a false mind. It's a mind of ignorance that is a wrong consciousness, a wrong awareness. And through the force of that, of course, we get ourselves into trouble. As we're going to be exploring today when we begin to analyze the I a little bit more, this person that is the self we cling to so tightly, then we want to, from that vantage point of this self, we want to satisfy that self, protect that self, do whatever we can to get what that self needs. And that self doesn't exist at all. The self in terms of the person, which we're going to get into this differentiation later today, but the person exists. You exist without a doubt. And that would be what would happen if we start learning about emptiness and dependent arising. We move away from this solidifying the person or any other phenomenon, and we fall into this nihilistic view, thinking that things don't exist at all. Of course, dependent arising is a wonderful reasoning because it helps us to avoid either of those extremes. That's why it's frequently called, as I mentioned last week, the king of reasonings. the king of reasonings takes us to that place of the exact middle way, which is what this whole philosophical point of view is called, the school of the middle way, this direct sort of razor edge between these two extremes, finding how things lack any of this inherent or independent existence that we are adhering to, but they don't have complete utter non-existence. Rather, they exist dependently. So even these two words, as I mentioned towards the end of last week, they imply that things are dependently arising, therefore they can't be independently existing, that extreme, but they arise. Therefore, they aren't utterly non-existent. They do have a way of coming into existence. So this is a very powerful reasoning, and I was encouraging you to work over the last week with meditation that Venerable Rabina had put together for the book Spiritual Friends on the dependent arising nature of the body. Of course, it's useful to meditate on the body because we have so much attachment to our bodies. We have been together with these bodies for the duration of this life, and we do think of them as somewhat solid and concrete. But if we begin to explore even just that first level of dependent arising in terms of causes and conditions, we see that the body is actually dependent upon all these factors. So hopefully you found that meditation to be useful. Let me go back into the slides and go over these three levels of dependent arising once more. First, I'll just give you an idea of what I'm going to, whoops, jumped ahead. How do I get back? There we go. Okay. These are the topics I'm going to talk about today. The first one is, and the whole purpose of today is really to focus on this second type of analysis. Last week we had undermining fundamental ignorance with the reasoning of dependent arising. Today we're going to look at this 4-point analysis, but I think it is good to start off with really once more refreshing our memory of what we mean by dependent arising and how it is compatible with emptiness, how it is pointing to the same reality. It's just coming at it from a different angle. And then we're going to look beyond that as to how we grasp at inherent existence using a little teaching from Lama Zopa Rinpoche, a short passage, and talk about that a little bit more. Although I've mentioned some of that, I think it's worthwhile to go into that before we go on to talk about the two types of selflessness or emptiness, and then the 4-point analysis of the I, which is the main topic for today. So let's go through these briefly, and then I'll see if there are any questions before we continue on, just to make sure there were no questions left over from last week. But last week we went into this idea of the 3 levels of dependent arising. The Buddha said that essentially everything that is impermanent or produced, impermanent here means changing moment by moment. Things that are cause, that have conditionality involved in their arising, they don't stay the same for even a moment. They are continually in flux. Our own minds are impermanent. They are always one thing arising and then something else arising, and we have a whole variety of things that are going on in our minds that keep it very much in flux, very fluid. And this is true for everything in the physical world as well. All the things that are produced, that are the objects of our senses and so on, that we see, hear, uh, taste, touch, smell, what have you, all of these are dependent upon causes and conditions. So that dependence upon causes and conditions means they cannot be independent of those causes and conditions, just as I alluded to in the meditation today. Even the state of enlightenment, in terms of attaining that goal, is dependent upon causes and conditions. If those causes and conditions are lacking, we don't have the effect arising, the phenomenon that is part of that chain of causality. So causality is the grossest level of dependent arising, but it's a very important one to understand because it is relevant to everything that we're involved in the Buddhist path, really understanding that we do have to rely upon that dependence upon causes and conditions to attain the results we seek and so on. The second level gets a little subtler, and this would apply to not just impermanent phenomena, but those phenomena that are unchanging, that we call permanent phenomena. Again, I won't go too deeply down that rabbit hole because it's a bit of a discussion about those things that are unchanging, but they are generally negations or things that we can talk about an absence of something. Even emptiness itself, the topic of this whole module, is considered a permanent phenomenon because the emptiness of a particular phenomenon doesn't change moment by moment. It is always a lack, a negation of that fictitious way of existing. So it stays the same throughout the life of that phenomenon. And when that phenomenon changes, it doesn't change. So it is permanent, while the phenomenon, often that is the basis of emptiness, does change. Anyway, these second and third ones pertain to all phenomena, whether we talk about permanent or impermanent. And the first level, the number 2 on there, is the dependence upon parts. Everything has parts. You know, we talk about a whole. A whole is always in relationship to the parts, and the parts can be generally identified as a myriad number of things that are all involved, usually infinite number of things that are involved if we get down to a much deeper level. So if we talk about even something as simple as this little metal bowl that I use frequently when I'm talking about emptiness, this metal bowl, we might think, well, it looks like it's all one part, right? Just as one solid piece of brass. But it has the rim, it has the inside and the base, it has the outside, and even within any one of those parts, like the rim, we could talk about the rim here, 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 directionally different. We can talk about even how any one particular point on the rim, if we go deeper into the molecules that make this up, and then subatomically go into all the various things. Of course, scientists are doing this continually, looking for smaller and smaller things, quarks and subquarks and what have you. I'm no expert on all of this, but nonetheless, they aren't finding anything that's sort of completely standing on its own that's partless. Everything has parts in the physical world. Even when we talk about our minds, any moment of mind has many different parts. A course that we teach as part of the basic program and that I've alluded to here and there called Minds and Mental Factors gets into the fact that you have all these various isolatable things going on in the mind at any particular time. And so we can isolate various parts of the mind and even talk about the 5 sense consciousness as being 5 different parts, the mental consciousness being its own part. We have a lot of ways that we could parse up the mind. And we can parse up emptiness even. We can talk about the emptiness of this bowl at this moment, at the next moment, at the next moment. You have temporal parts. Everything either has some sort of directional parts, spatial parts, or temporal parts. So those things that depend upon parts, the whole cannot exist without the parts. So the idea of a bowl, depending upon its parts, is that the label that we give it, calling it the whole, depends upon the parts being there. Without the parts being there, you could never have the whole existing. The third level of dependent arising, though, put it back up on the screen briefly, just so you can be reminded of that, is said to be the subtlest. And this is where we begin to look at those parts in terms of them being a basis for the conceiving of that phenomenon, for the imputing or designating of that phenomenon, how we label it as bowl. So here again, when we begin to analyze, we see that the subtlest way that this bowl exists is simply as a label that we give to this collection of parts. When all of these come together and they meet our criteria for what we decide to define as a bowl, well, then we can give that label to this phenomenon. But there's no real bowl that exists in my hand then. It's only designated, only imputed on this basis, on this basis of designation that we've all agreed to call bowl. We might call this maybe like more like a singing bowl or what have you, because we use it for meditation. But it's the same with regard to a wrist mala. I've got my little wrist mala here. This is a phenomenon that depends upon the basis of designation of a collection of beads, in this case, generally 21 beads, a string that goes through them, maybe the guru bead, the eye bead at the top, if you have those. Anyway, this is called a wrist mala, but it's a label that we give to this collection of stuff. When all of this comes together and is properly assembled in a way that we would, invest in it and say, oh, thank you, I'll purchase that wrist mala because we now can give it that label, well, then it exists in by basis or by virtue of that. It doesn't have any existence from its own side, which is what we're getting at with this reasoning of dependent arising. When we come to understand that phenomena depend upon their causes and conditions, depend upon their parts, depend upon designation, imputation by a conceptual mind, then we get that they can't possibly exist on their own. They have too many other factors they depend upon. So again, that extreme over here of independent existence, of existing on their own, apart from everything else, separate, setting themselves up, all these kinds of concepts that we talk about over here that we're adhering to right now, we think everything exists in that way. And moreover, they appear in that way. I'm going to talk about that shortly, because that's one of the errors that are the things that gets us into this erroneous mind. But this is refuted. This independent form of existence is refuted when we see that things are dependent, when they actually arise through all these various other factors. And of course, because they do arise, as I said earlier, we can't possibly think they don't exist at all. The Buddha never said things are empty of just mere existence. The Buddha said that they are empty of what we call inherent or independent or substantial existence. So the reasoning of dependent arising is an important one, and I would, again, hope that you were able to spend some time meditating on the emptiness of the body as was set out in that meditation. Are there any questions or comments on emptiness I'm sorry, dependent arising, before I go on to talk more about emptiness today using this other reasoning? Anyone? Okay, if there aren't, again, feel free to put things into the chat box if you need to ask a question, or you can certainly, yeah, put your hand up. There's that little thing that you can do in Zoom that lets me know that somebody has a question. But if things do come up throughout the class, then just feel free to do either of those. And then I'll also certainly open it up for questions a little bit later. So His Holiness goes into, and the book we're using again for this course is this wonderful book that is one of the best books. I mean, emptiness is not a beginner topic, but this is one of the best beginner books on emptiness in terms of those who are new to this topic. And so the first topic I wanted to get into, I wanted to, of course, review dependent arising, but also talk about how these two are very compatible and how they do point to the same reality, the same truth about things. And so pages 76 through about 77, I'm going to read a little bit of this, where His Holiness has a section called Reasoning from Emptiness to Dependent Arising. And His Holiness says, to me, it seems easier to understand emptiness by reason of the fact that person and things are dependent arising than it is to understand that an object has to be a dependent arising due to the fact that it's empty of inherent existence. So we can say that these two thoughts get at the same reality, but it is often easier for us to understand that things must be empty of inherent existence because they're dependent arisings, rather than the converse, which is what His Holiness is referring to, that if we understand emptiness, does that necessarily, help us to get that things are dependent arisings? Not necessarily. And it's, again, it can be a little bit tricky. He says, here are his thoughts about why that's so. He says, within falsity, within the reality of things not existing in the way that they appear, and so on, contradictions are completely feasible. For instance, a youthful person suddenly ages, or someone who is ignorant gradually turns into a scholar, knowing much. In a world of inherently established fixed entities, though, such radical change would not be feasible. This is one of the biggest understandings in terms of when we begin to embrace the reality of things changing, even that coarsest level of dependent arising. It must be implying that things can't have any sort of fixed inherent existence. I mean, it's even hard sometimes for us to believe that this is what we're believing in, that what our ignorance is adhering to. But if we take a deeper examination to what ignorance is grasping at, we see that it is the idea that things have their own nature from their own side, completely fixed, determined, and unable to change. So change could never occur if things existed in the way that our ignorant mind is grasping at them. So His Holiness goes on to say, if a tree were truly, fundamentally as it is in summer, with features like leaves and fruit, then circumstances could not affect it and cause it to lose those features in winter. What we're dealing with here in New Mexico, right? The trees were, all green and had, fruit on them, certainly up in the, north of here where there's apple orchards and things like that. And then all of that is gone now, and we have these barren trees, with no leaves. If its beauty was self-instituted, it could not turn ugly due to circumstance. Maybe that's a bit of a judgment on His Holiness's part. I actually find bare trees really beautiful, but nonetheless, from his perspective, that's how they are appearing to him. All the lushness of the green in the summer is gone, and it does, for many people, appear quite ugly when we get to winter. So none of this change could be happening if things were inherently existent, if things had their own identity. So he says, what is false can be all sorts of things, whereas what is true must be just as it is. When someone's word is not reliable, we say it is false. The fact that phenomena have a nature of falsity is what allows so much change. because they aren't fixed and solid in any particular identity. This is why things can change. This is why growth can occur. This is why things transform. This is why, even death occurs, is because of the reality of them not having a fixed identity. Of course, impermanence is also a part of that. We're not denying that. That's one reason why, even I think I pointed this out last week, realizing impermanence is a good stepping stone to realizing emptiness, is because we begin to embrace the ever-changing nature of all these conditioned phenomena. But that is pointing to their emptiness. That is pointing to the fact that they couldn't be inherent, fixed, stable within some mode of identity, or else that change couldn't possibly occur. So then he goes on to talk about persons. He says, because persons and things are devoid of the trueness of being self-instituting, they are affected by conditions and therefore are capable of transformation. Because youth is not an abiding truth, it can turn into old age. Because phenomena are false in this sense, he says, they are ready to immediately change. Areas fill with people and then lose population. Countries at peace start fighting wars. Nations form and disappear. Good and bad, growth and decay, psychic existence, samsara, and nirvana. This way and that way. Change happens in so many ways, he says. The fact that people and phenomena change indicates that they actually do not have their own individual status, just as they are. They are not able to set themselves up. Because they are foundationless, they can transform. So this is him really giving uh, one of the main entryways for understanding emptiness through the reasoning of dependent arising. Although, of course, he wasn't even touching on this third level, the subtlest level of dependent arising. He was staying with the first level, right? Simply talking about causes and conditions. That because there are causes and conditions operative all the time on those type of phenomena, impermanent phenomena, they can't have a fixed identity. So this is why all the lower schools below this middle way point of view actually adhere to this. They think that if things lose their inherent identity, then they go out of existence. They think that it is part and parcel of just things changing and what have you for them to have some sort of inherent identity. But according to this point of view, if they had inherent identity, they couldn't change. In fact, again, as he pointed out, why we can change our minds into the state of Buddhahood, why we can actually accomplish that goal is because our minds are empty of inherent existence. If your mind were solid and fixed and set up from its own side, it would never change. You would always be under the control of ignorance, always be under the control of the delusions. So this is an important thing to kind of getting to this valuing of dependent arising and emptiness, to really see that these two work hand in hand, and to use your own reasoning of dependent arising to be able to discern emptiness. So once more, this is how we find that middle way between these two extremes. Even in the Heart Sutra, which I said I would talk about when we read it together earlier, we have this wonderful statement to this. That very first line when Avalokiteshvara is expounding upon emptiness after his little introduction, he says, form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Form is not other than emptiness. Emptiness is not other than form. We get into this understanding that what we call form, or that sort of dependent arising side of it, is emptiness. Now, we're not equating them in all ways. We're not saying that all emptiness is equivalent to form. Form is the sort of conventional nature that things have. We're going to go into this in more detail next week when we talk about the two truths. But the form is what appears through the variety of causes and conditions, who dependence upon its parts and dependence upon us designating it as form. Its other nature in terms of abiding with it, entirely there, inextricably bound up with it, is its emptiness. Emptiness and form and its emptiness are together. We can't really talk about one without talking about the other. And this is what the reasoning of dependent arising is even alluding to, right? It's saying that you have things arising on the basis of these factors. They're together, therefore, with an emptiness of any independent existence. They abide together with that. So we say form is emptiness, emptiness is form. These are always together with each other. Any phenomenon that we point to in the world, whether it be ourselves, whether it be our computers, whether it be the sky, the trees, whatever phenomenon that we look at, we can also talk about its emptiness. The emptiness abides together with that in an unchanging manner, while those phenomena that I just talked about, they're always changing moment by moment. and they sometimes even go out of existence, right? The emptiness of dawn began when dawn came into existence, when, my parents labeled me appropriately as Don, and then Don, the being, continued throughout this life, and the dawn will come to an end. There will be a point where Don's, physical body ceases to support the mental consciousness, and the being we know of as Don will go out of existence. But throughout the duration of dawn, as long as there is this phenomenon we call dawn that is existing, there is the emptiness of dawn. And that emptiness is always there. So when we talk about emptiness, although we can look at it in a very general way as a phenomenon that we can discuss how to realize it and how to get at it, it's quite specific. It is applying to a particular phenomenon. We can't really talk about emptiness except in relation to a phenomenon. And if we come to understand that phenomenon as a dependent arising in the way that we did through what we just looked at, as well as in last week's class, then we can see its emptiness much more clearly. We can discern that that emptiness is abiding together with that phenomenon. That's why we, have Avalokiteshvara saying this, that we have to understand the dependent nature of form to really get at its emptiness. And we can then understand its emptiness in relation to its dependent arising. That these two are pointing to the same truth. One's just simply looking at it in terms of how it dependently arises, and the other is looking at it in terms of how it lacks any independent existence. Again, those of you who were here when we looked at the video, Jan Willis was speaking to this. And when we hear it in English, it sounds very logical, right? If things lack independent existence, therefore they must have dependent existence. If they have dependent existence, they must lack independent existence. These two seem so compatible when we speak about them in words. But nonetheless, when we go in and actually do reasoning, we can have that danger still of not negating enough so that we don't move away from that extreme, and still, maybe through our negation, falling into the other extreme, thinking that somehow things don't exist. We vacillate between these two. There's a wonderful little passage here where His Holiness, just a few pages later, page 79, he talks about how it's good to move back and forth between these two types of reasonings even. Dependent arising, as I said, is really helpful to not have us fall into this nihilistic bent. It, of course, moves us away from the more eternal bent over here that we're currently involved in, where we think everything exists independently. But it keeps us from falling particularly into that extreme because, as the very name says, and as I said earlier, things arise. They are dependent arisings. They originate from causes and conditions, parts, imputation. Therefore, they can't possibly be utterly non-existent. So His Holiness says, in this way, if you sometimes put emphasis on the appearance that is empty of inherent existence, and at other times put emphasis on its emptiness of inherent existence, moving from the one to the other, rather than just concentrating on emptiness, it can be helpful. Such alternating reflection helps ascertain both dependent arising and emptiness, showing that emptiness is not off by itself, not isolated, but is the very nature of phenomena. And then this is where he quotes it. He says, as the Heart Sutra says, form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. So this is what we're going to be going into today for the remainder of today, is to investigate one of the techniques for getting at emptiness, not necessarily with a support of dependent arising. We're not looking at the reasoning that things arise in dependence upon factors. We're trying to truly understand how things lack any independent existence, any inherent existence, by coming to see their true nature through an investigation that we call this 4-point analysis. And so this is a reasoning that can be used to help you to discern that emptiness. But then you might fall into, again, that extreme, thinking, well, I didn't find this inherently existent person, which is the basis we're going to use when we do this meditation, this inherently existent I. Well, maybe I don't exist. Maybe things don't exist. You can logically come to that conclusion. If you introduce the reasoning of dependent arising, as His Holiness says, you go back to some place where you value appearances. You value that things still do arise. They arise in a dependent manner, but nonetheless they arise. They don't arise the way our ignorance thinks they arise, but they arise nonetheless. And then that will help us to kind of peel back from that, extreme of thinking things don't exist at all. So this is an important part of our investigation in this module, is to use at least these two main techniques that are taught in this tradition. The reasoning of dependent arising to help us primarily to negate any of that nihilistic view, but the reasoning of this type of analysis, the four-point analysis we're going to do today, and there are others that I won't have time to introduce in this course, but I've been going through them on Wednesday nights in a bit more advanced way, but nonetheless, and we need to have something that gets us to this understanding that things lack this concrete existence, this inherent existence, by seeing that we cannot find them under deeper analysis to exist in that way. So emptiness helps us peel back from that side, dependent arising from this side, and we find that middle way. His Holiness says if you alternate between those realizations, you can come to that conclusion over time, that form is emptiness, emptiness is form, that these two are pointing to the same reality, just kind of two sides of the same coin. One from the vantage point of their dependency, the other from the lack of their independence. So hopefully I've made that clear through my repetition of this. Let's go on to the next point that I want to discuss today, which is this idea of our grasping at inherent existence, which again, I think is an important thing to insert here to make sure that we do understand what is all transpiring in the light of our ignorance that we're trying to refute. This whole analysis, as we pointed out earlier, is to help us to move away from the ignorance that we've been wrapped up in since beginningless time. How this ignorance operates is an important part of this, though. And again, I've alluded to a little bit of this here by talking about false appearances and so on. But I wanted to share a passage that is from Lama Zopa Rinpoche's Virtue in Reality, which again is on your book list for this course, and particularly this article that's called Meditation on Emptiness that is here in this book. On page 75 at the bottom, Rinpoche talks about three things that are involved in this ignorance arising and us kind of cultivating that. So he says, basically, there are three things in the evolution of all this. First of all, as a start, our mind merely labels the object. So, of course, as a prelude to this, we have to say something appears that will be labeled as the object. We don't just label objects in space. I don't say, oh, there's an elephant in my room when there's no basis for an elephant in my room. Or let's use something more realistic. I have 3 cats. So I say, is there a cat in the room? And we look around the room and we don't see any basis for a cat. The 4 legs and the body and the head and the tail and the fur and the little cat face and what have you. We don't see that basis, so we don't have any object to label as cat. But once there is an appearance of a basis, we then decide that we're going to label that particular object. Of course, we learned the labels for objects in terms of language when we were quite young. And so we're learning new things here and there because there are always new things being produced, right? I don't know when the iPad and the iPhone were first created, but before that, you didn't have those phenomena. They didn't exist, and maybe in somebody's imagination. And until all of it came together, and Steve Jobs and Apple and whatever put together this whole product that they call an iPad, then until that time, you do not have the phenomenon called iPad. But we give labels to various things, and we've gotten so used to labeling things that again, we don't think about that being a part of the process. But nonetheless, every time something comes into our sphere of experience, we label it through some form of conceptual designation, especially if we're going to deal with it, talk about it. We don't, label everything that's in our room at every moment, obviously. But if I'm looking for a particular book, then I'm, knowing, okay, that's the label that I'm looking for, and I'm trying to find, the phenomenon that meets that label, and so on. This is the first step in terms of our organization of our world. And we have to do this. If we didn't label the things in our world, we couldn't even manage, right? I mentioned that last week when we were talking about this dependence upon labeling. We need to organize our world so that I can talk to you about emptiness and all these various Buddhist teachings, or else you wouldn't have any idea what I'm saying, right? You'd be like, oh, I don't, Don's just spewing off a bunch of words, but I don't have any idea what these words refer to. These words have references. They have things that they are defined as that are the basis for those words coming into existence. Recall that I said last week, it's not purely linguistic. There is even pre-linguistic conceptualization involved. But most of what we get involved in our world is obviously driven by our giving labels to things verbally. through our language and so on. So Rinpoche talks about how first, that's what happens. A basis appears to us. He doesn't say that, but nonetheless, that's implicit in here. You have to have the basis for a book for you to then label it as book. Otherwise, again, we can imagine book or what have you, but for our initial designation of it, when we were kids, when our parents first read us our first book, right, and we came to learn what book was, there had to be a basis for that. If you had a child and you didn't have a basis for it, and you said, "Okay, darling, would you like me to read you a book?" But they didn't know they never had a basis for book. They might hear the label, but they wouldn't know what it was. So there always has to be a basis for something to be designated. That basis appears, and we give it the label. In this case, we'd label this as book. Then Rinpoche says, second, the negative imprints left by previous concepts of inherent existence project the appearance of inherent existence that the object we're looking at now exists from its own side. This is happening pretty instantaneously. This is this deeper factor in our ignorance that is definitely something we have to be aware of. This is what makes it very hard to extract ourselves from this ignorance, is because right after we label things, the label seems to absorb into the object as if the object has its bookness from its own side, or the cat has its catness, or the computer has its computerness, or the iPad its iPadness. Like the designation of it seemed to simply be a cursory thing involved in getting at what is a real identity from the side of the basis. This is due to, as Rinpoche said, us having had this ignorance since beginningless time. Again, most of you have studied mind and its potential, the first module of DB, or are aware at least of this idea of mind being continuous, mind having no beginning, mind having no end. Yes, we can have an end to our deluded mind when we become liberated and enlightened, but nonetheless, the mind will never go out of existence because it is a phenomenon that depends upon prior moments of mind. And because it depends upon prior moments of mind, there's no initial point, because mind can never arise from nothing. So we've had this ignorance in our mind since beginningless time. This ignorance has left imprints. In Tibetan, the word is bakchak. These are imprints that are left on our minds that give rise to this dualistic appearance, things appearing to exist from their own side. Of course, we give it a label conceptually or through our language, such as book, and then bookness seems to be established out here. It seems to have, again, its own identity from its own side by way of its own characteristics. It sets itself up as book. Of course, we aren't aware that this is happening. It's not like a little red light goes off warning, you are now under the influence of an appearance of false existence or inherent existence. Rather, this is happening naturally through the force of these imprints in our minds. These are actually the subtlest things that they say we remove at the very tail end of our path to enlightenment. We first have to get rid of the false conception of that, which is the third step. So first we have the labeling of the object, such as book. The bookness seems to appear from its own side, as existing from its own side. It has that appearance, that false appearance, to our eye consciousness as well as to our mental consciousness. And the third, we allow our mind to believe this is 100% true, Rinpoche says. We allow our mind to hold on to this, to grasp this as completely 100% true, that there's a real book over there, or a real person over there, or a real I here, or whatever it is that we are observing. So this is the threefold step that's involved here. Let me put them on the screen just so I can reiterate them through the slide. So I'm giving, again, just some other words to this, but the basis of the object appears. Rinpoche, again, didn't indicate that, but that always has to be there. And Rinpoche knows that. He just simply didn't say that at that time, or it was missing from that particular transcription of a teaching. And that is then labeled as that object. So we give the label of book to what appears to us as the basis for book. We give the label of I to what appears as the basis for I. And we give the label for whatever, depending upon whatever is appearing to us, in alignment with conventional designation. This is why we can communicate and why we sort of organize our world in ways that we can relate to each other and talk about the world that we live in and so on. Secondly, the object then appears to exist from its own side. kind of this appearance is, again, not out there. This appearance is a stain in our own minds that causes that false appearance to occur. That false appearance does exist, but the way it is appearing in terms of as if it existed from its own side, that doesn't exist. That's what needs to be refuted. That's why, again, the false appearance is actually showing us very clearly what needs to be refuted. That phenomena, books, people, so on, exist from their own side, exist by way of their own characteristics. We have lots of ways of talking about this, but they're all fictitious. They all are false appearances. Then thirdly, the ignorance assents to that false appearance. It agrees with it. As Rinpoche says, it holds on to it as 100% true. This is the nature of our ignorance, is that what appears to it, it is believing in without any hesitation. This is why, again, I think, we can understand, and we're going to talk about this at the tail end of this course, we can have an even greater compassion for beings, because most beings don't even have an awareness that this is going on. When we take a course like this and through our own investigation or hearing teachings from Rinpoche or other great teachers, we begin to question, what is the nature of reality? But this process is operative for every one of us, whether you have these teachings or not. And we need to become aware of it and know that there is this false appearance that is occurring. And we are agreeing to that. We are assenting to that. We have to start the process by getting rid of this agreement, this misconception that believes in that false appearance, that thinks that that false appearance is true. That is what we're doing through these reasonings. The reasoning of dependent arising that we looked at last week, the reasoning that we're going to look at this week, which has to do with undermining our strong grasping at that I by recognizing that this is a false appearance. The appearance of the I, or of any phenomenon, being able to set itself up to exist on its own, isn't indicating its true reality. Its reality is that it lacks that. As is often said in the teachings, there's not an atom of inherent existence in any phenomenon whatsoever. So this is how we are undermining our ignorance, is through getting at this process, these threefold things. First, we merely label, then it appears back as if it's real, as if it has its own reality, and then we adhere to that, we grasp at that. We have to begin here because things are going to continue to appear false. So we have to at least begin to not assent to that, not agree to that, not get caught up in it in the way that ignorance has kept us bound in this misconception since beginningless time. Over time, it's said that once we begin to strengthen our realization of emptiness and eventually remove that misconception, we then can go on to remove that false appearance, these subtle imprints in the mind that are actually said to be, I mentioned earlier, they're the last things we remove. That's because they're what keep us from having the mind of a Buddha. A Buddha's mind is non-dualistic. It no longer has anything that's kind of separating one thing from another. It is knowing all things at all time. It's omniscient mind, and it's behaving from that place of complete omniscience and knowing exactly what needs to be done in accord with the karma of beings. Well, we don't have that mind because we have this very subtle block that keeps us from having this non-dualistic mind. It keeps us in a dualistic thing of things appearing to exist out there on their own, even if we don't believe in them. Even if we've gotten rid of that misconception, they still have that appearance. This false appearance and the imprints that give rise to it is the final thing we need to get rid of on our path. So it's just giving you a little more information as to where this all fits into the entire path to enlightenment. But we begin with, undermining the ignorance, and remember that I alluded to this earlier. We get rid of ignorance by coming to understand that the object that it's believing in, that it is convinced of, as Rinpoche says, 100% convinced, that object doesn't exist. I use the analogy, I think I did this here. I'm teaching so many classes on emptiness these days, it's hard for me to remember what I taught where. But I frequently use the analogy, if you didn't hear it, of a child who's afraid of a monster in the room, right? And sometimes young kids, maybe they see something, a movie, and there's a scary figure in it or whatever, and they think that the monster's out to get them. And so this child is not sleeping well, waking up in the middle of the night with nightmares and having these fears that, there's a monster in the room that's going to get them. Well, how do you convince a child that the monster doesn't exist? I mean, you can't tell them, oh, well, don't think about the monster. Don't think about the monster. I mean, that may work to some degree, but they're still going to have that idea that was planted in their minds that's appearing to them. It's their adherence to that, their belief in that that needs to be overcome. So what you might do with a child before they go to bed to show them that there's no monster in the room is do an analysis, which is what we're going to do in this meditation, which essentially is to take a flashlight for the child and go to all the corners of the room and go to the closet and up in the ceiling area, wherever there might be a monster. And by pointing that flashlight in all those directions, shining the light of wisdom, if you will, into all those areas, the child comes to see that there's no monster in the room. There's what was believed in and was keeping the child from having good rest and, keeping them in a state of fear constantly. All of that is fiction. And eventually over time, maybe the first night it doesn't work, the child still believes that somehow there must be a monster there, even though you pointed out all the areas where it could be and showed that the child that it wasn't there. Might still think, oh, well, there's still some place where the monster is, or the monster's going to come in, and get me or whatever. So eventually over time, though, the child becomes convinced when you keep analyzing and keep showing the child that what it's believing in is false. So this is, again, an example that I think works fairly well, to point out the state that sentient beings are in, that we ourselves are in. We've been believing in this monster, this thing that doesn't exist at all. And the Buddha's out of the Buddha's compassion and wisdom, we then can have these reasonings to help us to undermine that. And this one that we're going to do today is particularly effective because it is pointing to this I, this person that we're clinging to, that's at the center of all of this. So before I continue into that, it's about break time. It's 11:31 or so here. So let's go ahead and take a break for about 10 minutes. So around 11:41, we'll reconvene and I'll go further into this idea of how we discern selflessness or emptiness through this reasoning. Yeah, let me just check in if there are any other questions before I proceed, just to make sure, keeping everyone up to speed. Don't hear any. So again, feel free to post them in the chat box if you wish. Let's go back to my little agenda of what I'm going through today. Page back up. We had how we grasp at inherent existence was what we just talked about. A very brief topic that I want to allude to first before we go into this 4-point analysis is what His Holiness speaks about this a little bit at the beginning of this investigation into this, the two types of selflessness. We often use this word selflessness as equivalent to emptiness. But when we use the word self, we have to be mindful that there is a self that exists and there is the self that doesn't exist, that things are selfless in regard to. They don't have that level of self. So here I wanted to share just a little bit from what His Holiness says. First of all, just to delineate what we often talk about as the selflessness of the person, which is what we're investigating here, or the emptiness of the person. Now, persons include any being, but the main one that we initially look at is the I, the self that is within our own continuum, the person. And when we are talking about selflessness, again, we're talking about a fictitious way that we think that we exist. That's why things are selfless. They lack that form of a self, that inflated sense of a self. And this is true. Oops, I didn't finish off this slide, or I started something that I didn't finish. The second topic is selflessness of phenomena. And whenever you hear that term, it's referring to the emptiness of phenomena, but phenomena that are other than persons. So we often divide it into these two, and you might wonder, well, why do we do that? Why do we talk about selflessness or emptiness of persons, and then selflessness or emptiness of phenomena? And I'll get into more clear definition of what we mean by self in a moment. But the idea is that what I was going to finish on that slide where it says His Holiness says His Holiness says we should investigate first the selflessness of persons, and quite specifically the person that is within our own continuum, the I that we are clinging to so tightly. So this selflessness of persons is taught more specifically as a beginning point for us to investigate emptiness. Because when we come to understand the lack of an inherently existent I or person, then we can very easily apply the same logic to other phenomena. And why it's good to start with I, there's a couple of reasons that are given generally. The main reason that's given is because this is where all of our problems start. Remember how I, in the very first class, talked about the tree of ignorance, and we have this tree that grows from the roots of ignorance. This is the tree of samsara that we're involved in. It's all rooted in ignorance. Ignorance gives rise to the entire trunk of the tree, which are all the various states of mind that we have, good, bad, or indifferent. And then the branches that we have from that, which are all the actions we commit on the basis of those states of mind. Some are virtuous actions, and we get good fruit from that. Some are non-virtuous actions, and we get rotten fruit from that. This is how we experience suffering and happiness within samsara, but it's all rooted in ignorance. And the main ignorance that is involved is the grasping at the I, the self, the person to exist inherently. This is how we get into trouble, is because when we reify and hold that I to be existent in this way, we then get involved in all these various states of mind on the basis of the things we like, get attached to those, grasp at those. The things we don't like, we push those away. We have anger, aversion towards those. And then we create karma on the basis of that. The entire process is said to be rooted in this misconception of an I, this grasping at an I, or sometimes as it's called, self-grasping. This self-grasping is what is governing the whole show. So that's why it's good to start with realizing the emptiness of the I, or the person first, and then go on to apply the same understanding to other phenomena. But there's another comment that I saw in a book by Geshe Jampa Tekchuk, I think it was, who says essentially that another reason why we should start with that is because it is a little bit easier to realize the lack of an inherently existent I, because we can see to some degree how the I does depend upon other factors. Like if I, how I point this out sometimes is if we're looking at a group photo, back in the days before COVID, when people would get together for retreats or what have you, or some of the classes I would teach at other centers, and they would do a group photo before I would leave or whatever. You get this photo, and you can go, oh, there I am, right? You do that on the basis of your body being there, right? I mean, the eye isn't really there. And of course, in a photo, your body isn't really even there. It's just a digitized version of your body that was there at the time. But we already can see that there's a strong dependence upon something else appearing for the I to be there. So we can begin to get a little bit of this idea of the I being dependent and therefore lacking any independence. And it's a little bit harder with some other phenomena. Nonetheless, it still can be hard with regard to the I. But this is what His Holiness says, is that we should start with the I because it's at the core of all of our problems. If we weren't grasping at the I in this way, we wouldn't get caught up in all the various things we do in samsara. We would still have these pleasurable experiences, these unpleasant experiences, but we wouldn't have all of the delusion that arises on the basis of that, because we don't have a target that is underneath all of that. So you can, again, read a little bit more about that in His Holiness's book at the beginning of this analysis. But the one other point that I was mentioning earlier that I want to make sure I cover is in regard to self, because it can get confusing if you're new to this terminology. His Holiness says, in Buddhism, the term self has two meanings that must be differentiated in order to avoid confusion. One meaning of self is person, or living being. This is the being who loves and hates, who performs actions and accumulates good and bad karma, who experiences the fruit of those actions, who's reborn in cyclic existence, who cultivates spiritual paths, and so on, who becomes a Buddha. There is a self that conventionally exists, that is a dependent arising. And we will use this term sometimes, self, to refer to the I, the person. And in that context, when we refer to it as that, it is not a deluded state of mind necessarily. This is just the way that we designate a person, is as a self. When I think about myself, I, me, what have you. The other meaning of self occurs in the term selflessness, which is what we're investigating here in this course, right? It's equivalent to emptiness, where it refers, in that case, the word self within that, to a falsely imagined, over concretized status of existence called inherent existence. Or again, we've been using other terms, substantial existence, independent existence, existing from its own side, and so on. The ignorance that adheres to such an exaggeration is indeed the source of ruination, the mother of all wrong attitudes. Perhaps we could even say it's devilish. This is a devilish state of mind that we gets us into trouble, that is the source of all of our problems. So when we say selflessness in this context, we mean the absence of that self, that exaggerated self, that over concretized sense of self, that everything that is beyond just the merely imputed self, which is what we refer to as just the self. So the previous slide was referring to that self that is conventionally existent as the person or the being. Here it's referring to the object of negation, what it is that we want to negate through our reasoning, to come to see that this exaggerated sense of self doesn't exist at all. So in observing the I, that depends upon mental and physical attributes, our mind and body, this mind exaggerates it into being inherently existent, despite the fact that the mental and physical elements being observed do not contain any such exaggerated being. So we are overlaying this exaggerated sense of self on the self that exists, the I that exists. But we are giving it qualities that are totally in contrast to how it actually exists. We are imputing, designating all kinds of stuff on top of it that is the force of our ignorance. Whereas the mere designation of I or self isn't ignorance. It's a valid awareness of what the person is. But we take that basis of the mind and body that we impute this label on, and we throw all this other kind of stuff on top of it. We think the I exists substantially, inherently, from its own side, by way of its own characteristics. Again, many ways of talking about how this ignorance is observing that I and embellishing it, exaggerating the qualities. So that was just to delineate very clearly, hopefully, these two types of selflessness and what we mean by self in the term selflessness. If self in the term selflessness simply meant the conventionally existent I, well, then we would have problems, right? Because then we'd be negating that, and we're not negating that. We don't go so far as negating that, otherwise we'd fall into a nihilistic bent. So this four-point analysis, I'm going to introduce it very briefly through the way that His Holiness introduces it. This is our way of overcoming this sense of an exaggerated self that we are falsely conceiving of in relation to the I, the self, the person that does exist. So these 4 steps to realization, as he calls them, what I often call the 4-point analysis, starts with the first step, which is to identify the ignorant beliefs that must be refuted, or what we often call the object of refutation or object of negation. He says you need to do this because when you perform analysis seeking yourself within the mind and body, or separate from the mind and body, which is what we're going to do in this analysis, and you do not find it, you could wrongly conclude that you utterly do not exist, or you may not go far enough in what you're identifying and think that you still do exist inherently. So we have to correctly identify what it is that we're trying to refute, what it is that we're actually trying to negate in this analysis. And then I'll take it off screen in a moment and talk a little bit more about this, but let me share a little more what His Holiness says. Because the I appears to our minds to be established in and of itself. Remember what I just alluded to with Rinpoche before the break? He says that there's that false appearance. Because it appears to our minds in that fictitious way, when we use analysis to try to find it and it is not found, it seems that the I does not exist at all because it's together with that appearance. Whereas it is only that independent I, that inherently existent I, that does not exist. Because there is a danger here of stumbling into denial and nihilism, it is crucial as a first step to understand what is being negated in selflessness. So this very first step of the analysis, as many teachers say, it is the most important step. Because if we clearly know what it is we're trying to refute, then that the rest of the analysis just kind of unfolds and it works very well. If we aren't clear in that, then we're going to have problems because, as His Holiness was pointing out, if we think that it's more than just this independent existence and inherently existent I, if we think it also includes just the mere existence of the I, we're going to fall into nihilism without a doubt. We're going to think that once I refute that I existing, well, then I've refuted any I existing. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when he talks about this object of negation, he often uses the term the real I, and that's because our view of reality is encompassed with that, because that's how things appear and that's how we grasp at them. So when we talk about the real I, that doesn't negate, if we negate that real I that Rinpoche is talking about, it doesn't negate the I as a mere dependent arising from existing. It's not denying any level of reality. It's just denying what we call real in this context, which is this idea that things exist on their own, independently, that they set themselves up, that they have their own identity. This is what we're trying to refute, and this is what we have to very clearly identify in this first step. They often use the analogy of, like, if you were in a large crowd, again, nowadays not happening, but imagine back like at an outdoor concert or whatever, and you got all these people and they're all standing, and dancing or whatever with the music that's going on. And then you suddenly reach down and you realize that somebody's taken your purse or your wallet or, some valuable thing of yours. Well, if you were ever to find the thief in the audience, you'd have to have some idea of what the thief looked like. If you didn't see the person, or maybe you did see the person, but you didn't take any notice of them, you thought they were just another concert goer having a good time, and then you looked down and you saw your wallet or your purse was missing, you'd have to know what the thief looked like in order to be able to apprehend the thief. So it's the same, similar type of concept. If we are actually going to negate this I that is the object of this ignorance, which is this inherently existent I, we have to know how that appears. We have to know what it is. We have to be able to kind of do that very careful kind of, I don't know what the word would be for it, kind of a surgery where you kind of are removing the sense of an inflated I from the I that is merely imputed. This is why I always start with dependent arising, because dependent arising gives us an idea of what this I looks like. This overlay of an inherently existent I, we need to identify what that is and isolate it so that we can refute this and leave this standing, so that we don't have the nihilistic view. But if we don't clearly understand what this looks like, good luck. We're not going to get there. We're going to, as His Holiness says, negate too much. We're going to think it's the same as this I, and when we negate it, there's no I at all. Or we're not going to negate enough, and we're going to leave some of this behind because what we removed is not sufficient enough to get at that ignorance, at the object of that ignorance. So this is an important step. Again, they say identifying the thief, or having some idea, what the thief looks like, what this thief of our happiness essentially looks like, because this is the reason why we've been dealing with samsara and our complications of existence since beginningless time. Let's go on to the next step. The next, oh, wait, he has one more. I'm sorry. I thought that was all the slides for His Holiness. He says here, how does I appear to your mind? This is kind of what we want to do in this first step. It does not appear to exist through the force of thought, right? I don't appear to be merely imputed. Rather, the I appears to exist more concretely. You need to notice and identify this mode of apprehension. It is your target. It is the thief. It is what you are trying to negate. So we're going to talk in a moment about how to do that. I'm just kind of doing His Holiness's little introduction to this. But this is the first step. You have to know what it is that you're trying to negate, to get rid of, to destroy within that conception of an inherently existent I. You have to have a clear idea of what it is that mind is grasping to. The second step is to determine the possibilities for how that I could exist, if it did exist in that way. So he says here, the second step is to determine that if the I exists the way it seems to be, the way it's appearing, it must be either one with the mind and body or separate from mind and body. So this is an interesting point to talk about just a little bit, in terms of these two possibilities. If you essentially say, is Don in the room here where I'm at, my Gompa and office, am I in this room? Or am I not in this room? Is there a third possibility for Don being somewhere? If Don exists, Don is either going to be in this room or Don's going to be outside of this room. Outside of this room includes an awful lot of territory, right? I could be in Timbuktu and be in somewhere not in this room. But nonetheless, is there a third possibility in terms of in this room, not in this room? And that's essentially what we're looking at with this second step, is we're saying the possibilities are that this inherently existent I that we identified in the first step is either going to be with this stuff right here, this mind-body complex, or the collection of mental and physical, it's usually the term it's given is aggregates. It means kind of components, things that are built up that are sort of a heap of stuff, a collection of stuff. Essentially, those boil down to mind stuff and mental and physical stuff. So we have mental and physical components to our being. It's going to be somewhere together with this, which seems like the most likely possibility, right? Because this is where I think I am. I don't think I'm in Timbuktu right now. I don't think I'm out in the other room, my living room right now. I don't think I'm out in the yard or going for a walk right now. I think I'm here right now because my mind and body are here right now. So that's one possibility, right? That this inherently existent I, that I will be able to find it. Because the whole idea of it being inherently existent, that it sets itself up, is that we must be able to find something that is it then. Well, it's going to be somewhere on this collection of stuff, some part of it, or some, it in its entirety, this mind-body complex that we're referring to. So we'll investigate that in a moment, but that's the first possibility. Well, what's the other possibility? That it's apart from that, separate from that, just like Don's either in the room or Don's not in the room. There's no third possibility. Either this inherently existent I is together with all this stuff, locatable, findable with all this stuff, or it's findable apart from this stuff. And you might think, well, what's the point of looking at that? Does it make sense? Because like Don just said, Don doesn't feel like Don's in the room unless the mind and body are in the room. But nonetheless, there are some traditions that came out of the Buddha's time and certainly are still practiced in the Vedic traditions, where they held to what's called an Atman. Atman being this sense of a self or soul that is eternal, that is another component of our being that the Buddha never found any evidence for. The Buddha taught anatman, that this doesn't exist. And many of us are raised in traditions where we believe in a soul. I was raised Catholic, and I was taught from a very early age that I had an immortal soul, this sort of piece of God or whatever it was that would go on to my experiences in the afterlife of eternal, glory with God or eternal damnation in hell or whatever, you know. So we do have that sometimes instilled in us, that there's something else that is us, or that there's some other separate component that's here together with, you know, um, with our being, that's kind of hanging out there together, that's apart from the mind and the body. But nonetheless, that is a possibility. So we have to exhaust it, whether we have that misconception or not. So two possibilities. The second step is saying, what are the possibilities? They're twofold. This inherently existent I exists here together with this stuff, the mind and the body, or it exists completely apart from it, separate from it. Is there a third possibility? Again, do the analysis, see if you can come up with a third possibility. You might say, well, it's both. Well, how could it be both? I mean, at one time or another, it's either here or it's not here. You can't have something that is both, because it would be denying that, if I said I'm both here and not here, does that make sense? Again, we just have to use logic. Buddha's very much a fan of logic, so if we find that it's logically impossible for there to be a third option, we have to accept that and don't get too, kind of loose about it all and what have you. So let's go on to then what follows from there makes sense, because if we've determined two possibilities, then we have to look in those possibilities. The third and the fourth, the final two steps, in those you analyze to see whether the I and the mind-body complex can be either be one inherently established entity or different inherently established entities, utterly, completely different, unrelatedly different, like a pot and a pillar. So what we're going to be doing in those last two steps is we're going to actually look to see whether we can find the I to exist in that way, whether we can actually, isolate something that is this inherently existent I. Recall that, like I said earlier, if the I exists in this independent, inherent way, we should be able to point to something that is it then, because it sets itself up. I mean, if we do this real briefly with another phenomenon, such as my trusty bowl here, well, we might look at this and say, well, there's a bowl here in reality in a deeper investigation, because the bowl seems to be entirely one with this collection of parts. But it is a collection of parts. It looks like one solid piece, right? So we have that deception present because it seems like it's one solid piece, but there's the rim of the bowl. As I pointed out, there's the inside of the bowl, the well of the bowl, the base of the bowl, the sides of the bowl. Well, which of those are the bowl? You'd say, no, they're all together the bowl. Well, but then do you have many bowls? You have the bowl that is the rim, the bowl that is the inside, the bowl that is the base, the bowl that is the outside. No, I mean, if you have something that is a combination of parts, you can't say that you can find a whole that's independent of those parts. We already looked at that with dependent arising, right? The whole depends upon the parts. So in this way, when you investigate, you don't find that there's anything that holds its own entity as being the entire bowl, existing from its own side as bowl. Rather, you only find the parts of the bowl, none of which are equivalent to that totality of bowl. We have that phrase in English, right? The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Well, in a sense, there's some truth to that, because the whole seems to have some sort of reality that covers the entirety of the parts, that is encompassing all of them. But when we actually do the analysis and get down into it and look at all the individual parts, we don't really see anything that is inherently the bowl, because the bowl is one, and the parts are many. So how can you have something which is many be one and be the equivalent? Because you have to be able to find it to be exactly the same. That's what we mean by inherently one, finding something that is that. So again, I'm just pointing out a little example that maybe works for some, maybe not for others. But we can do this analysis, by the way, with any phenomenon. We're going to choose to do it with the I, because as His Holiness says, this is a good place to start, because this is our problem. This is the main, difficulty that we're having, is grasping at this strong sense of a unitary I that we think is inherently here, independently here. So that third step becomes very important to refute it here, but we also have to refute it being anywhere else, as I was pointing out. Let me just check what's in the chat box, since I haven't. What is the difference between the soul and the indestructible drop? Okay, indestructible drop. People are bringing in a teaching from the death and rebirth teachings. Indestructible drop, those of you who aren't aware, is said to be this very subtle consciousness that is abiding with wind inside. For those when you're a living being, it's abiding together with a white and red substance that came from your parents, the white from your father, the red from your mother. These are very subtle things that are talked about in Tantra, very subtle matter that this seed of consciousness and the wind that it rides upon are abiding in. Well, what do we mean by a soul? I mean, this gets to be a maybe deeper investigation than what we can do today. But in some ways, a lot of people allude to soul, or at least in the Vedic traditions, when they talk about Atman, my understanding is that they see it as something that is unchanging. Whereas the indestructible drop is changing all the time, because our consciousness is changing, the drops themselves are changing. Everything is a produced phenomenon. And in that way, it would be momentarily changing. So we have that being an inconsistency, because something that we allude to as soul that is unchanging is not equivalent to that. Moreover, when we talk about that indestructible drop, you actually, when death occurs, the red and the white substances that are there together, that are the basis for your consciousness, they actually are left behind. You don't take them with you. They came from your parents, and they go with this body. And when this body gets put in the ground or in the oven to be cremated, they're together with that. What goes on from this life is the subtle wind and consciousness. And that's again, a momentary phenomenon that is going to go through its iterations together with an intermediate state rebirth, where it looks for its next existence, and then together with the next existence that arises on the basis of that rebirth, and so on. So you don't have anything you can point to that's sort of a constant that is equivalent to the soul, in my estimation. In Buddhist terms, though, again, soul is a made-up phenomenon. I mean, you can call this a soul if you want to, but I don't think Buddha would call it a soul. The Buddha would say, this is consciousness. This is your subtle consciousness that is the thread that goes through all of your lives. Sure, we're not denying that that is there, but that is not equivalent to the self, and it's not equivalent to a soul. So anyway, maybe that's all I can say about it today, but I wouldn't make these, I usually don't use terms like soul or even spirit when I talk about these phenomena in Buddhism, because they're quite clearly defined as what they are, mind, wind, indestructible drop, what have you. They are referring to specific phenomena, and the Buddha would not equate them in any way to soul or spirit. some of the qualities that we talk about in terms of a soul, that it's eternal, this would be true for our consciousness, right? Our consciousness is eternal. There's no ever diminishing of consciousness in totality to where it utterly doesn't exist. And there never was a point where it didn't exist. I don't know if that's true about souls or not. I never understood souls completely when I was in my Roman Catholic years. It's a strange phenomenon. And the Buddha simply said there's no basis for it. What do you point to and say is the soul? Because what we're pointing to, that you want to make the, kind of look at the difference between soul and that phenomenon, somebody in the Vedic traditions wouldn't say that that's your soul at all necessarily. I don't know what they'd say, but I don't think that they'd necessarily say that. So anyway, that's a kind of a side issue. Let's get back into our analysis. And what I'd like to do now is to go through um, let me go through what His Holiness says again. He then talks a little bit more about the conclusion we should come to. And we'll do kind of deeper investigation of this. But if we look in this collection of stuff, this mind-body complex, and we don't find that inherently exists in I, if we look outside of this and we don't find it, we should come to a conclusion. So he says, through meditation, you gradually will come to understand that there are fallacies, with I being either of these, being equivalent to the mind-body complex or completely apart from, separate from. At that point, you can readily realize that an inherently existent I is unfounded. This is a realization of selflessness, that false sense of self. You have negated it. You have said it cannot exist. Then, when you have realized that the I does not inherently exist, it is easy to realize what is mine does not inherently exist. All the phenomena that exist in the world that we refer to as mine, or even that we don't, all those things can also be realized as lacking inherent existence through a similar analysis. So the first step, identifying the target, what they often say before I go through this instruction, this very first step, which again was identifying that object of negation, getting very clear in our minds what it is we're trying to refute. This involves bringing that to the forefront a bit. It is present whenever we have a delusion present, without a doubt. And it is present even sometimes when we don't have a delusion, in our minds. Lama Tsongkhapa says there are some moments where we don't have that actively arising, but it doesn't mean we're free of it. It just means that we don't have that idea of a false I there. But for a good portion of every day, we have that there. And you might think it'd be very easy to identify because it's with us so much of the time. Nonetheless, it's not so prominent as just a part of the fabric of our lives, because it's like the water that fish swim in. It's just part of our being, and we don't necessarily notice it. So what they say is that you should conjure up a stronger sense of that I that does arise in particular situations when we have strong emotions. The ones that they often point to are more fearful things, like if you've been, at danger of losing your life. If you can recall, if you were in a car accident where you had that moment where you think, this is the end of the line, and that strong sense of an I that comes up on the basis of that fear arising of losing one's life. But you can also do milder versions of that when you've been falsely accused, or when you've had strong anger in your mind. And it's not to relive those emotions. It's not to go back to that place and say, oh, now I'm going to be in fear for the rest of this meditation. No, it's to bring up the strong sense of an I that was present at that time, that seems so real and so solid. Again, it's not to say that we don't have it at other times. It's just more prominent, more noticeable when that's the case. So the main instruction is to try to isolate that strong sense of an I that doesn't seem to be involved in mind or body. It seems to have even its own entity, its own identity, that it's setting itself up. Sometimes we'll have a feeling like it's someplace in the body, but that's, again, maybe just an indication of what that is like when it manifests within us physically. But this strong sense of an I is the object that we are, again, revolving around all the time. It gets us into so much trouble. So this is the first step, as His Holiness puts it. And this is directions he put together with Jeffrey Hopkins, who helped him with this book, How to See Yourself as You Really Are. He says, first, imagine that someone else criticizes you for something you actually have not done, this false accusation thing I mentioned earlier, pointing a finger at you even and saying, you ruined my party, or you told that person a lie about me, or whatever it was. something that you didn't do. I mean, it's bad enough when it is something that you do, but when it's something that you didn't do, it seems even worse, right? So this is a strong sense of I that we feel we need to defend when we've been falsely accused. Watch your reaction. How does the I appear to your mind at that time? Doesn't it seem to have some sort of substantial nature, kind of there in a very concretized way? Then go on to the next few steps in this. In what way are you apprehending it? How is your ignorance apprehending the I at that time? And then he says, notice how that I seems to stand by itself, self-instituting, established by way of its own character. It seems to have a reality, that is self-identifying, that is, setting itself up. And these are the ways that, again, this is talked about. It's fictitious, so none of that is reality, but it is how it appears at that time, how we are apprehending it. Okay, then going on to the second step, you then determine the choices. You first analyze whether the I that is inherently self-established in the context of the mind-body complex, this I that we just caused to arise in the first step, whether it could have a way of existing other than being part of, meaning equivalent to in its totality or some portion of the mind-body, or completely separate from the mind-body. So again, these are the two choices that we talked about earlier. You have to go through your own investigation to see if there is, if that makes sense, that this inherently existent I is either going to be here together as part of or identifiable with some portion or or even the totality of this mind-body complex, or it's going to be utterly different, completely different, unrelatedly different, completely separate from mind and body. Watch your reaction. How does the I appear to your mind? When you begin to investigate these two possibilities. Oh, maybe that was a leftover. I'm sorry, that was a leftover from here. I did these slides yesterday and I made a few errors. I usually don't make so many errors. Sorry about that. So the second step isn't watching your reaction and seeing how the I appears. The second step in this one is see that there's no third category of existence. They are either the same or different. You're not going to find some third option, right? Just like, is Don here in this room or is Don not here in this room? Is there a third possibility if Don exists for him to be somewhere other than those two possibilities? So thirdly, decide that if the I inherently exists as it seems to, it then must be either one with or separate from mind and body. We either have to find something identifiable as that within this mind-body complex, or we're going to find it utterly separate from. So from here, what we do is kind of two possibilities, and you can certainly do both. And in the meditation that you have, I think it does encourage you to look at the first of these investigations. This is the meditation that is posted at the Dropbox. It's called the 4-point analysis, and I'll go through that in just a moment briefly. But in this third step, where you are analyzing for sameness or for oneness, trying to find if the inherently existent I exists in here, one step that you can do, which is kind of an interesting investigation, is to go looking at, well, is there something I can find? Just like, analyzing with the monster in the room, shining the flashlight into all the corners. You kind of shine the flashlight into all the corners of the mind and body and see if you can find something that is the I, that is identifiable in all ways as this unitary I, right? We think there's a unitary I. We don't think there's 5 eyes or 10 eyes here, but there are many, many parts here. So when we begin to investigate, we have to find something that's unitary. Well, am I equivalent to just my body? Well, if we look at body once more, we talked about earlier, body is a label that we give to this collection of stuff. Well, where is the real body? There's no real kind of body that's setting itself up. So it's very hard to even find what we mean by body other than this thing that seems to cover this entirety from the top of my head to the bottom of my feet. So could it be equivalent to the body? Well, that would mean that you would never have any moments where you would be identifying with your mind, because the I is only the body, because it's a unitary phenomenon and it's equivalent to the body. And this getting you into some of these consequences. This is the second way of looking at things. You can start to examine and see if you can find something that is the I. That's sort of the physical investigation, that searching out. But you can also see the consequences if it were equivalent. If the I were utterly one with the body, you would never have a moment where it would be identified with the mind. If the I were utterly one with your mind, completely one, inherently one with your mind, you'd never have any identification of your body as being the I. So when you looked at the picture of the group, you'd say, oh, I don't see myself. I don't see my mind there. Well, no, we know that, we see the body and we can clearly say, there I am. There's a picture of me. So again, we would have complete, utter, inability to identify with anything else if we found some part of the body that was us in its entirety. But of course, if you do this physical investigation or even picking apart the mind, you don't find anything that is the mind or is the I in all ways, in this inherent way. Am I completely equivalent? Even this question that was raised about the soul and the indestructible drop. If I do a little, analysis using tantric physiology, and I kind of get to this indestructible drop, or even just the subtle consciousness and wind that abides there, is that equivalent to me in all ways? Is that the inherently existent I, or is that findable as that? It would again deny that any other experience of the I not being that would be valid. I could never have a thought that I'm, my body, or that I'm just my coarser level of mind, my thoughts and so on. You wouldn't have that ability to identify with anything else because that is you in all ways, inherently, substantially you. So again, there's kind of two ways that you can do this. Let me put the one on the screen that goes with the in your homework, the meditation using the 4-point analysis. This is what I'm going to ask you to work with over the next week. So he, as was put together in this meditation, right there, where in the middle, where it says, once your identity appears, this strong sense of an I, this first sense, this first step, decide that if this exists concretely, it must be findable either with the body and mind or independently of the body and mind. So the third step, first analyze your body. Is this inherently existent I the body? If not, check if it is part of your body. Check from the top of your head to your toes. Ask the question, am I the same as this in every way? If you cannot find the body or any of its parts the same as yourself, then conclude that I am not findable in the body. This strong sense of an I is not locatable as the body in its totality, or as any part of the body. Then analyze your mind. Question, am I identical with my mind? Am I identical with a part of my mind? Just my mental consciousness? And that would mean I'm never identifiable with any of my sense consciousnesses. Apply this analysis as described in the teachings. When you are certain that you are not identical with the mind or a part of the mind, then conclude that you cannot be found in the mind. Now, analyze if you are identical with the combination of your body and mind, what we call this mind-body complex. Use examples to look for differences. For example, you can touch yourself by placing your finger on your arm, but is this the same as touching the combination of your body and mind? It isn't, is it? When you are certain that you are not identical with the combination of your body and mind, determine that you are not findable in the body or the mind, or both of them together. Now, again, that thing about touching your arm, I don't know, I'm not a big fan of that. That wasn't something I put together in this meditation. Another way that you can look at this in terms of first you analyze the body, then you analyze the mind, then you analyze the mind-body complex. Well, what is a complex? And we put this mind-body complex. It's already two things that are together, right? It's the mind and the body together in this basis. So once more, does that mean you have two eyes? You have the mind that is the I that is the mind, the I that is the body, because you have two things that are involved in this complex. A complex, by its very definition or collection, the mind-body collection, it involves more than one thing. So this gets into some of the other sort of consequences that we can look at. I won't have time to go through maybe all of these, but I do want to share these because this is an important part of it. So His Holiness, and again, I'll put these slides, I'll give them to Mary to put out on the website in the Dropbox so you can find these, but you should hopefully have His Holiness's book. It's around page 140 something that all of these are set out, each of them sometimes in a separate chapter. So he says, first, consider the consequences if the I is established in and of itself, in accordance with how it appears to our minds, and if it also is the same then as mind-body, as opposed to different. That's what we're going to look at in the last step. First, I and mind-body would have to be utterly and in all ways one, never having any thing that would be different than that, because that's the sameness of it, is that the I is equivalent then to the mind body. Then he goes on to say, in that case, asserting an I would be pointless, right? If the mind-body complex is already the I, it's inherently the I, well, then why do you even think of it as I? It's already an I from its own side. Furthermore, it would be impossible to think of my body or my head or my mind. And we do that all the time, right? And wake up and say, oh, my body is aching today, or oh, my mind is really a mess today. Well, you wouldn't be able to do that because you already are your body and mind. Fourth, another consequence is when the mind and body no longer exist, the self also would not exist. Well, the self of this life doesn't exist when this body ceases to be a basis for my consciousness and so on. But nonetheless, it doesn't utterly go out of existence, completely go out of existence. There's no annihilation of the self and that occurs at death. Rather, the self that was imputed on the basis of this collection of stuff goes out of existence, and a self that is now in the bardo, the intermediate state, and then into my next existence, and so on. There still is a continuity of self. But when mind and body no longer existed, then the self would be utterly, in all ways, annihilated. Why? Because it's equivalent to the mind and body. Fifth, another consequence. This is what I pointed out earlier. Since mind and body are plural, they're two phenomena, one's person's selves also would be plural. But I'd have two I's here, the I that is my mind and the I that is my body. Or the alternative is, since the I is just one, it's singular, my mind and body also would be one, which is contrary to how we could never identify them as distinct, because they're one. My mind and my body are one, no differentiation between them. So these are consequences. This is why this school that we're studying actually is sometimes referred to as the consequence middle way school. It's because they use consequences to help us to see the fallacy of our thinking. So this third step can be done in two ways. Again, kind of what was pointed out in that meditation of examining, go looking for this inherently existent I, just like you'd go looking for the thief in the crowd. See if you can find somebody who matches your description of the thief. And if you can, well, then wonderful, you've identified it. But chances are you can't. And that's the whole point of this analysis, is go looking for something that is absolutely equivalent, identical to this inherently existent I that you identified in the first step. The last step is to analyze for difference. And hopefully, again, you won't find anything that is. And I challenge you, come back next week. If you find something that is the inherently existent I in this mind-body complex that you are convinced is the I, come back with it next week and we'll discuss it. I'm happy to entertain doubts. I'm happy to help you to, investigate this and come to some conclusions. But my guess is that you're not going to find anything that holds up under analysis. So you've analyzed one possibility. Recall that in step 2, we said there were 2. Now we go on to the last one. So let's go through this a little quickly. It's a very easy one. We'll first use the meditation that you're going to be working with over this next week. He says again in this meditation, I think it's Triptan Pende who did this, but anyway, he says, through this analysis, now analyze, there it is, I'm sorry. Now analyze if you exist independently of your body or mind. Imagine removing all your attributes that are also attributes of your body and your mind. Then, when you look to see what's left, ask yourself if this is you, if there is anything left. Of course, I would say that maybe the Vedic traditions or those who believe in a soul might say your soul is left. You remove the body and the mind and all their attributes, and then you have the soul remaining on your chair. But that is one way we can do it. We can mentally think about, I'm going to remove my body and mind from where I'm sitting, or put them out in the other room. Is there something that is the inherently existent I that's left over? That's something completely separate and different from the mind and body. So you should come to the conclusion that there is nothing there either in that second possibility. You should determine that you are not findable independently of the mind or the body. And then you will arrive at the fact that you've refuted both of these possibilities. Let's go quickly to what His Holiness says on this. Again, it's very brief, but there are some consequences we can look at if it is completely different. So he says, consider the consequences if I is established in and of itself in accordance with how it appears to our minds, and if it also is inherently different from body and mind, from this mind-body complex. First of all, I and mind-body then would have to be completely separate. I could have a thought of I being in Timbuktu while my mind and body were here in Santa Fe. In that case, I would have to be findable also after clearing away the mind and body. Again, what I just said, mentally move the mind and body off the chair. Is I findable there? This inherently existent I findable in the absence of the mind and body? The I would also not have the characteristics that the mind and body have of being produced, abiding, disintegrating, which is absurd, right? There would be none of the characteristics that are happening. We would never think I'm my age, depending upon, whatever your age is, because the age is determined on the body, right? The body ages. The body was born, came into this existence on a particular day you call your birthday, and it's continuing to age. We would think that I'm something completely apart from the body. All the characteristics that are happening to the body, all the attributes of the body wouldn't pertain to me. The I would absurdly have to be just a figment of the imagination or permanent, like a soul or Atman. Absurdly, the I would not have any physical or mental characteristics at all. I could never think about it being something I could relate to in terms of what's going on in my body as being in any way relevant to me. What's happening to my body is happening to my body. That isn't me. I'm completely different. Again, I would go through the rest of this, and there's a few more paragraphs from His Holiness, a few more slides. I'll let you read those on your own, and they just follow in the book from that final step, that fourth step. But if you've investigated in those two places, and those two places were the only possibilities, you should come to the conclusion that the I doesn't exist in the way that you thought it does. It doesn't exist inherently. It is not findable as that. Now, again, this doesn't establish it as a dependent arising, but the information from your reasoning of dependent arising should help you to not fall into that extreme of saying, therefore, the I doesn't exist at all. Karma doesn't exist, rebirth doesn't exist, enlightenment doesn't exist, none of this exists. It's all a dream, it's all an illusion. Recall the Buddha said things are illusory, they're like an illusion, or they're like a dream. Things still do exist, though. Everything does still function. So this is an important analysis, one that I would encourage you to work with over the next week and then see what questions you might have. Does anyone have any final questions before we wrap up today, though? We're already about a minute after, but I'm happy to field a question or two. Anyone? You've all realized emptiness already. um, Again, this is one we have to do repeatedly. And it can be done again with any other phenomenon. As I was pointing out with the bowl, we can see, is bowl inherently one with any of this? And is it inherently different? Can I have bowl without the basis being involved at all? Again, we can come to the conclusion that there is no inherently existent bowl or inherently existent computer or inherently existent car, whatever phenomenon you choose to analyze. But we start with the I again, because this is where all of our problems start. They start when we grasp at this I as inherently existent, and then we have all these defenses for it and all the things that attract it and bring those in and push things away, and we create a lot of karma through the force of that and continue to go from life to life. Okay, so if there are no questions, again, do your analysis, see what, maybe even take notes after your meditations to see what came up for you. I would say that proving that the body isn't the I is pretty easy. Sometimes the mind gets to be a bit tricky. This is where even Sarah's question about, the indestructible drop or this very subtle level of consciousness, sometimes those get to be harder for us to discern, that can be no I there. But use both of these techniques, consequences as well as investigating, to see if you can pinpoint something that is the I, that you can go, oh, there it is. I found it. Instead, you should not find. Emptiness is the not finding, is the lack of that existing. Okay, let's do some prayers. So Anil, if you would kindly put up the prayers for the dedication verses, we'll start with those. And again, we're dedicating in line with our motivation for today. We were having this motivation of benefiting all beings. And so we're going to make these prayers that come from Master Shantideva's texts that involve every being receiving the benefit of what we're doing and what we've done here today. We can think specifically about those we're holding in our heart as well. It is important that we do that. Those who who are experiencing illness, obstacles, who are dying or who have died, bring them to mind and think that they benefit in particular. But we want to make this very vast and think that all beings will be free from all their sufferings and achieve the greatest happiness through what we've done here today. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And then finally, seeing how our own enlightenment and the enlightenment of all beings really depends so much on gurus, on guides. We want to make prayers for the long health and good life, good health and long life of these teachers that we have in our tradition, but we can extend this out to include good health and long lives for all spiritual guides. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech. May all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then for Lama Zopa Rinpoche, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally for Osalhita, who actually did a talk this morning, kind of intersecting with my time with all of you today from Florida, but who's Lama Yeshe's reincarnation. Let's recite this for him. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. All right, everyone. Thank you, Anil, for your hosting, and thank you all for being here. I'm looking a little fuzzy. I think my camera went out of focus somewhere along the line. Anyway, thank you all for being here this week, and I'll see you all throughout the week probably, but then certainly next Saturday. We have 2 more classes in this module. The next 2 Saturdays, it'll take us up to just before Christmas and that. So yeah, try to work with this meditation as best as you can. So, all right, blessings to you. Please stay safe and healthy. I'll see you soon.